Should congressional stock trading be banned? It's January 2022, and Americans are divided. Let's first dive deeper into the issue.
There's been a battle brewing over the past few months about whether Congress should be able to freely trade stocks. The central concern is whether they allow conflicts of interests and huge financial influences over legislation. Back in December, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi reignited the debate after she was asked why she's against prohibiting trading.
Because this is a free market and we're a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that.
Then just this month, two bills were introduced in Congress proposing new restrictions, one by Democratic Senators Kelly and Ossoff, and then another was introduced by GOP Senator Hawley. This is one of the few issues in Congress that actually has pretty wide bipartisan support, one of the very, very few. So if there's a good chance reform might actually happen, let's talk about changes our trading rules would need and what that might really look like. Currently, Congress doesn't have a limit over what they trade and how much they earn from stocks. And up until 2012, they were allowed to trade stock based on insider information in the open. That's like very illegal for plebes like you and me. But in 2012, Congress passed the Stock Act at an impressive margin for the Senate of 96-3. This forbids insider trading and requires Congress to disclose all their trades generally within 45 days. But the Stock Act has been less than successful. The penalty is quite small and often waived by ethics committees anyway. The standard fine is about $200, and that makes it hard to enforce. According to Insider's original investigation, in 2021, 54 members of Congress and about 180 high-level staffers violated the rule.
My guest today is Dave Levinthal, the Deputy Washington Bureau Chief for Insider, who led the investigation just mentioned. Dave's team published the Conflicted Congress Reporting Project, helping to reveal financial conflicts of interest and hypocrisy amongst the U.S. House and Senate. More than 9,000 financial disclosure reports were reviewed to inform Americans of the many moments when lawmakers' personal finances clashed with their public duties. In this episode, we discuss how researching congressional stock trading is intentionally made difficult by the government, the most eye-opening findings from the 5-month report, how Congress members reacted to their negative publicity, Nancy Pelosi's response to defending this trading, and more. Whether you agree or disagree with today's guest, I invite you to join me with an open mind as we work to heal the division on congressional stock trading. All right, Dave, thank you for joining me this evening. Let's start from the top. Who are you and why are you participating on the episode?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Dave Levinthal. I'm the Deputy Washington Bureau Chief for Insider here in Washington, D.C. And I'm participating because we recently launched and released a 5-day project that is 5 months in the making. It's called Conflicted Congress. And it's a project that was built upon many months of incremental and episodic reporting that we did on the personal finances of lawmakers up on Capitol Hill and in Congress. And we had found in our reporting, and certainly from the reporting of other news organizations who also too were curious about this particular topic, that there were many members of Congress who had potential, if not actual, financial conflicts of interest, where their personal finances were beginning to collide in a way with their public responsibilities. And in fact, we had found many examples of elected lawmakers who were violating the disclosure provisions of a law that Congress itself passed back about 10 years ago. Appropriately, it is called the Stock Act. And STOCK stands, in this case, for Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act. And this law was set forth to serve as really a bulwark and a check against potential conflicts of interest, and in its broadest sense, to be a defense against corruption in Congress. Unfortunately, as many would argue, the members of Congress who currently serve today aren't always necessarily living up to the standard that was set by the Congress 10 years ago when it comes to this particular law.
From the words of Insider, Conflicted Congress chronicles myriad ways members of the U.S. House and Senate have eviscerated their own ethical standards, avoided consequences, and blinded Americans to the many moments when lawmakers' personal finances clash with their public duties. It mentions that you and your team spend hours upon hours going through thousands of financial documents. So I want to start from the very beginning. What led you and your team to pursue this report?
Well, just by way of background, Insider, we've been a news organization for about a dozen or so years, but there had not been a Washington bureau of Insider up until the middle of 2020, when myself and a couple of colleagues were the first hires for the bureau, and now we are a bureau of 10. I bring this up because we're a different type of Washington bureau than a lot of news organizations have, in the sense that we are highly focused on enterprise journalism. We're highly focused on investigative journalism, and that can manifest itself in various forms, from very quick hit scoops that we might write and report in a couple of hours, all the way up to investigative projects that can take weeks or even months to ultimately produce, from conception to publication. And along the way, and fairly early on in the history of our bureau, we did notice a pattern. And what was happening in mid-2020? Well, of course, the pandemic was in full swing at that point. And there had been a couple of instances where certain lawmakers had gotten crosswise with public opinion, certainly when it came to their stock trades. One example would be Senator Richard Burr. He's a Republican from North Carolina. Another Senator Dianne Feinstein, Democrat from California, whose individual personal stock trades were being scrutinized because they were happening either with strange timing, or they were involving stocks that were very sensitive to the ebbs and the flows of the pandemic. And they weren't the only examples. So when we began to investigate this particular matter, we noticed not only that there were questions surrounding certain lawmakers' stock trades, but also too that there were lawmakers who were in a very real way just driving a truck straight through the law that mandated, that required of them by law, to quickly, at least by congressional standards, disclose the various trades that they might be making. What are these trades? These trades really involve just about any stock that you could imagine, and ones absolutely that were very sensitive to the decisions that were being made up on Capitol Hill, the decisions being made by Congress that had a profound effect on the nationwide reaction and response to the pandemic. So we found evidence of lawmakers trading in the stocks of Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, three companies that, of course, produce COVID vaccines here in the United States, but also companies that manufacture PPE, personal protective equipment, COVID tests, and well beyond. So as we discovered that there were a number of lawmakers who were sometimes weeks, even months late in disclosing the fact that they were making these trades, which is very important, and the law was put forth in this regard to ensure that the public would have a very transparent, open view of any potential conflict of interest that could be intersecting with public decisions and private investments. When they're not doing that, though, and when there is a lack of that kind of transparency, number one, it is in violation of the law, the letter thereof, and it's also in violation of the spirit of the law, too, which, because of previous problems that had happened with insider trading and lawmakers who demonstrably had been using information that they had gleaned or obtained by virtue of them being an elected official, by serving as a representative of the people, and then using it for their private gain, Congress, when it passed the Stock Act, said, no, that this cannot stand. This shouldn't be happening in the way that it was, and we need more transparency. I would just close that particular loop to say that when the Stock Act was passed back in 2012, there had been a push to just straight up ban lawmakers from buying and selling individual stocks in the first place. That element of the Stock Act did not come to pass. The disclosure element did, but the disclosure element is only as good as its adherence. And if lots and lots of people are not adhering to it, they're not complying with it, they're violating that law, that aspect of the law, then we find ourselves in a relatively sticky problem. And the bottom line, to flash forward, is we have found so far 52 individual members of Congress who just in 2021 alone, we have identified is violating the Stock Act as part of our project, Conflicted Congress. And then we found another 182 senior level congressional staffers, chiefs of staff, deputy chiefs of staff, general counsels, the top aides to members of Congress, who they too had violated the Stock Act. So if anyone says that the Stock Act is being adhered to, they have not read Conflicted Congress, because we certainly were able to identify and report out many cases to the contrary.
Can you walk me through the steps that your team had to take to actually compile this information over the months?
When you have a law about transparency, one might presume that the information that is being recorded, the information that is being provided by the members of Congress, who by law have to record and provide this information publicly, would be relatively easy to access or relatively easy to make heads and tails of, to analyze. In some cases, that could not be further from the truth. Let's take two situations here. First, the lawmakers themselves. The lawmakers themselves, when they buy and sell stock, they have between 30 and 45 days to publicly disclose the nature of a stock sale or purchase. They have to say what that stock is. They have to say what date they traded that stock on. And they also have to give a range of the value of that stock trade at the time that it was made. Now, these are fairly broad ranges. For example, the bottom range would be $1,000 to $15,000. Then it goes up from $15,000 to $50,000, $50,000 to $100,000, and so on. You never really get a perfect lock, but you at least get an estimate of how much, relatively speaking, that stock trade was worth. The problem is if somebody wants to, say, for example, determine how many members of Congress are invested in a company such as Pfizer or General Electric or any other company of the thousands that trade stock publicly or have their stocks traded publicly. And mind you, many of these companies are very, very actively engaged with the federal government. They lobby the federal government, sometimes to the tune of millions of dollars a year. They have millions or even hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars worth of government contracts that come from decisions that are made by the federal government. If somebody wants to find out, let's just pick on General Electric. How many members of Congress own General Electric? Well, there's no easy way to do that. In fact, there's no way to do that unless you quite literally go through every single page of every single report that's filed by a member of Congress, because the members of Congress are only obligated to file that information on forms, basically electronic paper, PDF files, which are fine in isolation if you're only looking at one member, but don't do you a whole lot of good if you want to have data that is searchable and sortable, which this is not. Also, too, we have the complication of some members, because they're allowed to, file on actual paper, and they handwrite their disclosures. And some of them have very bad handwriting. So we found examples of disclosures that are, for all intents and purposes, illegible. You can barely read them, or you can read this line here, but not that line there. And the notion of transparency goes out the window very, very quickly when you can't even parse what Congressperson so-and-so is putting on their disclosure form. So that is the members of Congress themselves. Now we have the related but separate issue of the senior level staffers for members of Congress. Their information is not available online as members of Congress's information is. You can't go to a website and just pull up every chief of staff for every member of Congress. It's impossible. It just simply doesn't exist. In addition to that, the information is only available physically in one place, and that's literally on Capitol Hill here in Washington, D.C. So if you want to access this information, you have to go during business hours at best and sit at a computer terminal that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, in a room inside an office building, either on the House side or the Senate side, not even one which will give you both. It's two separate ones. And those offices sometimes will be closed randomly for 2-hour breaks, or somebody's just not there. So if you're a member of the public trying to get access to this information, good luck. It's very arbitrary as to whether you'll even be able to get access to it in the first place. Putting aside the fact that unless you live in the Washington, D.C. area, you won't be able to easily access this. I mean, I just imagine somebody who lives in Texas or Florida or California or Hawaii or Anchorage, Alaska. And they would have to quite literally get themselves on a plane, fly to Washington, D.C., put themselves up, go to this office, which again may or may not be open depending on the day, and sit at these computer terminals that are very janky and oftentimes don't work, and get access to this information. Okay, so you do all that and you get access to it. Well, you can't download it. It's just not allowed. So if you want copies of these, you have to pay 20 cents per copy to print them out. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of pages to print out if you wanted a full census of all of this information. Or your other option is to, in essence, create a parallel database by sitting there and transcribing it from the computer terminal to your laptop computer, which would take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, right? Well, that's what we did. We recreated the database that is only available up on Capitol Hill, and to determine, at least for the purposes of our reporting, who was trading what over the period of 2020 and 2021. And I should give an incredible shout out to my colleagues, Camila DeShalis, Warren Rojas, and Kimberly Leonard, who were the three reporters who did this absolutely painstaking work in order to identify ultimately what they did, which was that 182 number of senior level staffers who ultimately were found, based on our reporting, to be in violation of the Stock Act. People might be listening and saying, well, how is that possible? However could that be the case? Why isn't it better? And the answer is because Congress decided that that would be the way that this information is made available. They made it hard on purpose. They didn't want the public to have easy access to this information. If they did want the public to have easy access to this information, at minimum, they would have made it as easy as we can access members of Congress's own information, which, as we just discussed, is not that easy in the first place.
Did this raise any red flags with members of the government?
Well, we flew under the radar for the most part up until around the time that we began asking questions about this information. After my colleagues had more or less recreated this database and realized that there were numerous senior level, top level staffers in Congress who were not complying with this law, and in some cases to quite an extreme. We found, and you can read this in our reporting, examples of people who were months or even years late reporting their stock trades, who may report to and work for members of Congress who have a very, very close hold on issues that are related to the particular stocks. Take defense stocks, for example. Might have worked for somebody who serves on a committee that dealt with Homeland Security or defense issues. We began to ask questions about it, and we reached out to dozens and dozens of staffers. And staffers oftentimes, unless they absolutely have to talk to the press, typically don't. It will either be the member, him or herself, or it'll be a press secretary or a communications director. But we weren't about to just stop there. We wanted to get answers from the people who were the ones who were making these 5-figure or 6-figure or even 7-figure trades as congressional staffers. And we got a variety of responses. Some simply did not respond at all. They didn't want to talk to us. Others would transfer our calls or forward our inquiries to the communications director, or in a few cases to the member, him or herself. Some of them blamed, ultimately, whoever we got on the horn or got a response from. Some blamed their financial advisor. Some pleaded ignorance and said, I just really had no idea how this law worked. I made a mistake. I'll own up to it. And the only problem with that is it's a similar answer as if you were, for example, driving 60 miles an hour in a 25 mile an hour zone, and somebody pulls you over, sheriff pulls you over, sheriff's deputy, and knocks on your window and says, "Sir, did you know how fast you were going?" You say, "Oh, no, I have no idea." And then the deputy asks, "Well, do you know what the speed limit is?" And say, "I have no idea. I'm very sorry, officer. I'll do better next time." And then the officer says, "Okay, well, that's good enough," and then walks away. I can't imagine if you're going 60 miles an hour in that 25 zone, that is going to happen too often. But in Congress, that happens a lot because the penalties are, first of all, very, very weak. You could be months or years late, and the value of your late disclosed stocks could number into those 6 and 7 figures, as I mentioned. And what would the penalty be? Well, the penalty may ultimately be as low as $200, which is the standard penalty for this type of transaction. And again, that too is the decision of Congress. Congress could make it much more onerous for somebody, whether an actual member of Congress or a senior level staffer, could make it much more onerous, bigger fine, greater penalty, really anything that Congress deemed to be fit for the transgression. But that too has not come to pass. That is not the case. And until Congress changes its mind and does something different and decides that the law as it stands right now is not good enough, if it deems that to be so, then the status quo will remain. And Congress has some decisions in front of it in that regard as to whether it wants to do anything about a law that dozens and dozens of people up on Capitol Hill are not paying much attention to.
A $200 fine, and are the people that commit these fines able to keep whatever financial gains they made?
Yes, this has no bearing on whether they can or will trade stocks. They can continue to do so. There is nothing that would be taken away from them monetarily as a result of this. In the most extreme of extreme cases, if there was some rank criminality that was suspected, and mind you, this is an incredibly difficult thing to prove, but if there was evidence of criminal insider trading that was taking place, then the Department of Justice conceivably could get involved. The Department of Justice, when we first started talking, we mentioned Richard Burr, senator from North Carolina. The Department of Justice did investigate him and did look into his particular case back in 2020, but by early 2021 decided to not charge him. That should be noted that only in the most extreme cases will the DOJ really look at these issues. Now, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, could also potentially get involved. They too had been looking in and still actually are looking into Richard Burr, but nothing has come of that in terms of any civil penalty. The truth is that Congress passes its own laws, and Congress is its own cop on the beat, and Congress is its own referee. It's a bipartisan Congress, right? Democrats and Republicans for the most part. And the Democrats know that if they get very, very aggressive with the Republican, then they full well know that Republicans, when given the opportunity, for example, say if Republicans win back the House of Representatives in 2022, that payback will be sweet for Republicans, and they will likely go back at the Democrats at least as hard as the Democrats went at them. And for something such as the personal finances of lawmakers, in essence, there is this detente, almost as if there's mutually assured destruction and nobody's going to fire at each other as a result of this type of knowledge. And this seems to be very much the case with the Stock Act and not wanting to really, really increase the pain or the penalty for that reason. And also, too, because Congress really doesn't like to limit itself in any way beyond how it has to. We saw no clearer picture of this than when one of my reporter colleagues, Brian Metzger, who works on our politics team, went to a press conference in December, asked Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, should members of Congress be able to trade stocks in light of the conflicted Congress report from Insider? And should their spouses be able to trade stocks? Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi, mind you, very, very, very wealthy individual, incredibly active stock trader. And I'm paraphrasing here, but Nancy Pelosi said, no, this is a free market economy. Members of Congress should be able to participate in that free market. Now, some of her Democratic colleagues vehemently disagreed with her. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example, Senator Elizabeth Warren. There have been some Republicans who have disagreed with Nancy Pelosi, and some odd cross currents in terms of Democrats and Republicans agreeing and not agreeing. But Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. And if the Speaker of the House does not want something, and many other people in Congress don't want something, then it's not going to happen. They hold the cards, they hold the agenda, and it would take something fairly monumental for that to change, at least in the moment.
What were the most eye-opening 1 to 2 discoveries that your team made along the way?
We decided that one way for everyone to see how lawmakers were doing, whether they made the grade, so to speak, was to rank every single member of Congress on a set of 6 different metrics, not including certain sub-metrics, that in essence painted a picture as to whether they were just doing the basics when it came to being transparent about their personal finances, whether it involved them having any issues with complying with settled law, and whether they were taking steps to avoid certain potential conflicts of interest. So we graded them all on whether they had violated the Stock Act, whether their staffers had violated the Stock Act, whether they submitted legible disclosures, whether they filed a sort of an abnormal amount of amendments to their disclosures, which meant that they had errors in them, and whether they took some proactive steps. Did they trade individual stocks in the first place, which is legal, but it's also a risk factor of sorts in the sense that you can't violate the Stock Act when it comes to individual stocks if you're not trading in them. Maybe you stick to bonds, maybe you trade mutual funds or very diversified investments. And did they do something which is called form a qualified blind trust? Now, many people may know what a blind trust is. A qualified blind trust is a special type for members of Congress. It entails some time, some expense, and actually getting this financial vehicle approved by either the House or the Senate Ethics Committee. And what it does is it basically says, okay, I'm a member of Congress. I am going to hand over all of my finances to an independent trustee. And that independent trustee will have the power to trade on my behalf. I will have no knowledge of any of those trades taking places. I will publicly release the formation documents and agreements, legal agreements to form this trust so that the whole world can see it. And it will be approved by Congress. Really, it's there, and Congress considers it the sort of the highest and safest way to have an arm's length or more than an arm's length relationship with your money and avoid potential conflicts of interest. So went on a bit there, but this is all to say that we rated every member of Congress. And to your other question of, well, who wasn't making the grade, or what were some of the specific things that we found as a part of doing this, we, I think objectively can say, unfortunately, found a number of different actual or quite potential conflicts of interest. One story I would highlight, the headline was, at least 15 lawmakers who shape U.S. defense policy have investments in military contractors. Probably don't have to read a word of the story for one to get the gist of what's going on here. You have people who sit on either the House or the Senate Armed Services Committee. They have oversight over the military industrial complex, if you will. They oversee the defense industry. There are billions of dollars that are intertwined with that relationship of the defense industry and the decisions that Congress is being made. And we found numerous examples of lawmakers who sit on that committee, who cast votes on that committee, investing in names such as Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Raytheon and Honeywell. The list goes on. That is all to say that they definitely, because of their investments, potentially could be making money or losing money based on decisions that are being made in Congress. Now, we've reached out to all of these lawmakers and put the question to them of, well, why do you do this? What do you do to try to avoid conflicts of interest? And many did blame their financial advisor or their stockbroker and said, well, this is not me making those trades. I'm not sitting there in Congress with a trading app and day trading Northrop Grumman stock. That was a common answer that we got. But that's all fine and good, but there is absolutely nothing, publicly or otherwise, that we have access to that would indicate if they are or are not directing their financial advisors to make certain types of trades, whether they're telling the truth, whether they have any considerations in mind long-term for their finances. Not my word, but some ethics folks that we talked to, they consider that to be one of the more egregious examples of potential conflicts of interest that our reporting bore out. We also found, examples of environmentalists. For one example, found this to be an incredibly hypocritical situation where we looked at all of the members of Congress who serve on a committee such as the Environmental and Public Works Committee that have a great deal of influence and sway over, as the name would suggest, environmental concerns and issues, climate change concerns and issues. And we found, again, a number of Democrats, close to 24, who are ranked very highly as environmentalists. They receive high grades from interest groups, environmental interest groups, such as the League of Conservation Voters. But these lawmakers themselves had investments in oil companies, Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, or if not them, or in addition to them, power companies that had a very significant fossil fuel portfolio as part of their overall energy portfolio, which may also include wind or solar, but definitely was very reliant on oil and natural gas or coal. That too was something that was very eye-opening to a lot of our readers. We got a lot of feedback on, and they just couldn't understand on a very fundamental level how that was possible. And the only answer really is that it's possible because Congress makes it possible. And Congress can decide to not make it possible if it wants to, but it has not. And the law of the land is that this type of activity can very much take place.
What backlash and criticism has your team received since releasing this report? And has any of that backlash and criticism come directly from members of Congress themselves?
Oh, we have definitely received backlash. And one thing members of Congress don't like is bad press. And one thing members of Congress don't like is to be judged or rated, especially relative to their colleagues. So we knew full well going in that if we were going to give a grade to every member of Congress, and I should note that we graded them in one of three ways. If you did a good job against our metrics for the most part, you received a green solid rating. If you had some issues, but nothing that was incredibly overwhelming, perhaps a staffer of yours violated the Stock Act, or you had some issues about transparency. The legibility of your disclosures was bad, coupled with a couple of other things. You got a yellow borderline grade, or maybe you had a very, very minor Stock Act violation yourself. And then there were members, 13 of them in all, who fell into the red danger zone. And that usually was multiple issues across the spectrum. Certainly a Stock Act violation for the member, oftentimes a very serious one. Oftentimes a member or multiple members of their staff also having Stock Act violations, coupled with other issues. And they, in some cases, were very concerned that this was going to be seen by the public and that it would be written about and that there would be some sort of disrepute that came to them as a result of them being judged in this way. And many wanted exceptions being made for this or that or another thing. And our standard answer to everyone, and mind you, everyone who received less than a green grade, a yellow or a red grade, we reached out to them multiple times, gave every single one an opportunity. And these are dozens and dozens of members of Congress. We gave every single one an opportunity to explain to us why this may have happened or why they fell short on certain measures. If there were any mitigating factors that we didn't know about that could be on the documents, and went so far as to say, we will publish within reason. Don't send us a 500-word op-ed, but we will publish within reason anything that you want to say about this, so long as it's on point and accurate, and you're not spewing inaccuracies that are easily disproved. Some of them took us up on this, others did not. But there were definitely a few who were not thrilled that we were doing this and wanted to find a way if they could improve their grade, or otherwise, if they were in the yellow, get into the green, or if they were in the red, get into the yellow. And then there were some members who just simply did not engage and we had never heard back from.
So what were some of these responses? And in your individual opinion, do you think they were valid?
I think it's important to note here that it's a very case-by-case situation as to what actually happened with the lawmaker. And I think if you look at each page that we have for every member of Congress, each one does tell a different story as to how that member of Congress conducts their personal financial affairs and how they do avoid conflicts of interest or not, if they do comply with the Stock Act or not. And also, too, if they plan to do anything different, which in a few cases, we've had members of Congress note that if they had a Stock Act violation, that they have put in measures into effect to make sure that that never happens again, or that if they had staff members in a high-ranking position who had violated the Stock Act, that that will never happen again. Some of them were definitely contrite and did not push back. They owned it. They said, and you can believe them or not, but they said that they will seek to do better and that what we are reporting on was an isolated incident. It was an anomaly and is not going to be part of an ongoing pattern. That, in essence, is why we did it, because we wanted to not only look at what had happened in the past and judge in the present where that stands, but also definitely give everyone an opportunity to talk about the future and their outlook on this. And if they chose to do so, explain publicly and to the public what steps they were going to take to do better next time.
Now I want to dive into how we're going to proceed from here. And so for that, I want to play the Nancy Pelosi clip that you previously referenced.
49 members of Congress and 182 senior congressional staffers have violated the Stock Act, the insider trading law. I'm wondering if you have any reaction to that. And secondly, should members of Congress and their spouses be banned from trading individual stocks while serving in Congress?
No, I don't know to the second one. We have a responsibility to report in the stock, on the stock, but I'm not familiar with that 5-month review, but if the people aren't reporting, they should be.
Why should they?
Because this is a free market and people, we are a free market economy. They should be able to participate in that.
What will ever prevent lawmakers from abusing or finding other loopholes, no matter how much publicity you bring to this issue, or no matter what the Stock Act does to try to prevent this type of behavior?
One thing that Congress itself has done is there is a bill that has been introduced in Congress. This was introduced back in March of 2021. The Senate version of the bill was primarily sponsored by Senator Jeff Merkley, a Democrat from Oregon, but co-sponsored by mostly Democrats, but some Republicans, both in the House and the Senate side. And that bill would ban members of Congress from buying and selling individual stocks. It harkens back to the provision that had been included in the original Stock Act and was taken out of the original Stock Act. In essence, what this is seeking to do is put that back into play. Where does that bill stand? Well, the bill at this point doesn't stand much of anywhere. It's languished at the committee level in Congress, which is oftentimes where pieces of legislation go to die. And it's been there for going on almost a year now. Now, whether that will, or this project, the Conflicted Congress project from Insider, will reignite debate over that particular bill remains to be seen. That will very much be up to Congress or up to the pressure that the public puts, if it chooses to do so, on lawmakers to take a look at that act. As I mentioned before, it's going to be a pretty tough sell when the Speaker of the House doesn't seem to have much of an appetite for moving forward with that legislation. And that's not to say that we or anyone else support that legislation or not. We are very, very neutral in all this, but we have pointed out through our reporting that clearly the law as it is written right now is not being followed by Congress. So Congress can take that information and do what it pleases. The public can use that information and do what it pleases. But there is a problem here that is objective and demonstrated if you care about laws being followed. So I think that is all very fair to say. What else is happening here? Well, there's a lot more reporting that we are likely to do around this area, and that this is not something where we have published our project and are just going to dust our hands off and say, we're never going to write about this again. This is an ongoing story, and we fully expect to be writing and reporting even more than we already have as part of Conflicted Congress. Another thing I would point out, too, is this was a 5-day series. It had more than 24 different articles that published as a part of it. It had the data visualization that visualizes the data that we use to underpin our rating of every member. And then on the final day of publication, we decided to do something that we hope is going to be a resource or serve as a resource for the public, concerned citizens, political people, journalists, and really anyone who would be interested in this information. And what it is the full set of data that we created. And this is not the data that we went up to Capitol Hill to get, but this is data for the lawmakers themselves, not the staffers. And what we did is we took all of those handwritten documents that lawmakers file and those electronic PDF files that are not searchable and sortable. We created our own database for that information. We cleaned it up. We fact-checked it. We spent hundreds and hundreds of hours to generate that database. And after it was up to snuff and it passed all of our standards and it was available to be consumed by more than just us internally, we decided to make it public for anyone to search and sort. So that example I gave earlier of wondering, what member of Congress owns GE stock or Boeing stock or ExxonMobil or Tesla, whatever stock you want, where that was impossible to search just a few days ago by the name of an asset or a date for a trade, that now is searchable and sortable because of the database that we released. So that's not to pat ourselves on the back, although we hope that people appreciate it. But it definitely is something that we do hope is going to be used for months to come for people who want to know more or frankly will do their own reporting, even if it's an entirely different other news organization. We know we can't write every story. We're a relatively small operation here in Washington, D.C. for Insider. There are dozens and dozens of different stories that could be told, especially by the local news organizations who may be in New Mexico or Nebraska or Vermont or anywhere across the country where they're the experts. Okay, the reporters there, the journalists there, the activists there, if they want to get involved, they know their local Congress people better than anyone. They know the issues that are important to their communities better than anyone. So now they have a resource available to them from us, but for their use to use for journalistic or other purposes in any way that they see fit. And I think that would make us all very happy is to see that this information, now that it is free and in the wild, gets used and just doesn't sit in a dusty database for us to use for our own purposes, but for anyone to use for their purposes.
And just to clarify, this database, which I'll be posting in the episode description, is going to be updated on an ongoing basis.
So we haven't decided yet. Now, we use this, it was designed to be, first of all, a snapshot in time. So we looked at all of the available information over calendar year 2020. That is the latest, greatest information in a comprehensive format for all members of Congress who are serving in 2021 and 2022. Now, come the middle of 2022, there is a lag with this, unfortunately, but come the middle of 2022, there will be a new set of information that lawmakers have to file about their 2021 finances. We haven't decided at this point as to whether we're going to do a full-blown update. It was definitely a very laborious process. It took us months to do, but in a lot of resources. So it would be definitely an effort to update it. But at least for now, for the next easily half year beyond, actually, this is going to be the best data set that exists out there. And in the meantime, for the incremental updates that we will get through the reports that lawmakers have to file about their specific stock trades here and there, today, tomorrow, the next day, but not give a full picture of their assets, we look at those every day and we report on those as we see fit. In fact, we found 2 more Stock Act violators the final day of our project being published back in December. That just goes to show you that the landscape is ever changing when it comes to this, and that there are still people in Congress who are not paying this close enough attention, at least for them to be able to avoid being in violation of the Stock Act.
Okay, so there will be listeners that will read your Conflicted Congress report. They'll hear about this in the news. They'll go through your discoveries and be bothered by what they're reading. But in your opinion, as someone who's been directly immersed on this issue for months, what do you suggest that the single individual person who's bothered by this issue, what can they do to actually take action and make a difference here?
Well, at the risk of sounding trite, they can contact their local member of Congress and they can find out any number of things. Probably the two most notable things to find out about this is, number one, if their member of Congress has been in trouble for some reason because of actions they took or didn't take, the constituent can very certainly weigh in or otherwise publicize the fact that they are upset by this. Definitely a number of routes of communication that are available to any citizen. Whether that will be effective or not remains to be seen in each case. But that's certainly their right to, as it says in the First Amendment of the Constitution, the part of it that a lot of people forget about, they can petition their government for a redress of grievances. And that very much entails communicating directly with their lawmaker. Another thing they can do is ask the question of, well, what's going to happen next? If you're not satisfied with this congressperson so-and-so, if you think that this is an untenable situation, Senator so-and-so, how are you going to change it? You make the rules. You are part of Congress. Is this going to be a priority? I mean, as we well know with every stage of a Congress, that one priority oftentimes will eclipse another. And then another priority comes in and eclipses another. And it's hard for Congress, I think, to, under even the most ideal circumstances, make a priority something that is very internally focused for them, where the question, the potential change in law would be all about the actions of Congress, especially at a time when we are, it's still in the teeth of the pandemic, when we're dealing with economic fallout, when we're dealing with foreign threats of all sorts, when we're dealing with energy and climate change issues. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on in terms of legislative priorities, say nothing of the fate of Joe Biden's agenda in a number of different ways as president of the United States. But that being said, there have been plenty of issues that have vaulted up the ladder of priorities in Congress as a result of public outcry. Does this become one or not? That too remains to be seen. But how did the Stock Act pass in the first place? It was because of journalistic reporting back 11, 12 years ago, coupled with public outcry, coupled with some members of Congress just being so upset and so fundamentally disgusted with the status quo that those factors, in essence, conspired together to result in something different and dramatic happening, which is why we're having this conversation today in the way that we are. We'd be having a very different conversation if the Stock Act, for all of its failures in compliance, was not a thing in the first place.
So for listeners that are interested, where can they learn more about you, your team, and your work related to this issue?
Foremost, you can go to businessinsider.com or insider.com. And all of these articles live there. You can definitely check out my Twitter feed, which is at Dave Levinthal. That's DaveLevinthal, where these stories have been posted throughout. And the easiest way is just Google or search for conflicted Congress in quotes. And many of our stories will be right there at the top of your search window.
And for listeners, again, the Conflicted Congress report will be in the episode descriptions. Dave, with that, I want to say thank you to yourself and your team for the work that you've done.
Well, it's my pleasure talking to you and my pleasure talking with the listenership in general. And certainly, if you have any questions, my email address is on my Twitter account, and you can feel free to email me directly.
All right, Dave. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Whether you agree or disagree with today's guests, I thank you for joining us with an open mind. If there's a guest or topic you'd like to have on the show, you can message me on all social media platforms through the handle Heal Our Division. Take care and stay kind. We have more in common than that which divides us.